if we could remove the burden of, I have to be bigger year after year.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, I'm so glad you joined us. And if it's your first time here, make sure you leave not only a comment, but subscribe to the channel. You'll never miss a thing. Well, I sit down with Karl Vaters today. We talk about desizing the church. You know, the vast majority of churches are 200 people or less, often much less. But we talk a lot about church growth. What are the upsides, the downsides, and what are the challenges of leading a smaller church? We talk about that. Plus, we talk about the challenge of growth for those of us who lead larger churches. Today's episode is brought to you by Compassion. You know, for over 70 years, Compassion International has worked tirelessly to help others know their identity in Christ through the local church. They do everything through the local church. My church has partnered with Compassion for over a decade, and I want to encourage your church to get involved. Find out more by simply going to compassion.com/Carey. And getting in front of people who need your message most can seem like a mystery, like really hard, right? Gloo Plus automates direct mail to 50 new families to your community every month and connects you with up to 7 people who are looking for answers your church has. Curious? Go to gloo.us/connection and use the code CareySave20 for an additional 20% off your subscription. And now my conversation with Karl Vaters. So Karl, good to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Carey. It's been a while. When I was on first, it was back in you only had about 30 or so episodes out.
You're one of the originals.
You're in, what, the 600s or something? Yeah.
We're pushing 700. I don't know. It's crazy. Wow. In a decade. Yeah. A decade. Isn't that nuts? Yeah. A lot of joy, a lot of gratitude, and who knew we'd be doing this 10 years and counting. So It's good. We're going to talk about church size, or rather desizing the church. But I'd love to trace out, because that was a long time ago we had you on the podcast. We've gained a few listeners since then. When did this become an issue for you? Because basically that's what you do now. You help small, normal-sized churches. But when did church size first come on your radar as an issue, Karl?
Yeah, I've been in pastoral ministry for 40 years. I've been 31 years at my current church here in Orange County, California. And when I came here, the church growth movement was really booming. And I came to a county where Saddleback Church and the original Calvary Chapel, the original Vineyard, Mariners Church, Church on the Way, all these big churches, and Fuller Church Growth Institute itself is just over the border in LA County from me. So I come into this place not just where big things happen, but where big movements have begun. I mean, they just made a hit movie about a church 2 miles from my church, right? The original Calvary Chapel.
Right. Yeah.
So I looked around and went, well, this is the place. We're going to make this happen here. And we came to a church that was really hurting. They'd been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. There were 20 people on a typical Sunday, a dozen on some Sundays, 30 on a big Sunday. And the Lord helped us to really turn that ship around. It took some time, but it turned around. And then as we kept applying the church growth principles, they were helpful, but they didn't produce the numerical increase that I expected and that they seemed to promise. Right. And long story short, it got to the point where I got so frustrated, I walked away from the church for 40 days in real frustration and real discouragement, thinking, I'm just blowing it here. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I'm not even called to ministry. And during that season, I went to a pastoral counselor and talked through some of my frustrations. And he really helped me begin to recalibrate how to redefine success in ministry. And the sentence that just turned everything around for me, he said, Karl, for your own spiritual and emotional health, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I said, I don't even know what that means. And he answered me honestly. He said, yeah, I can't tell you what it means either, but if we don't figure it out, it sounds like it's going to take somebody out of ministry who should be in ministry, and it's going to continue to hurt your church. So from that point on, I've been trying to figure out, how do we define success in ministry without numbers attached to it? Is that even possible? Is it possible for a church to be healthy and stay small? And since then, I've been finding all the resources that I can that are small church specific, and trying to encourage discouraged pastors like I was, and to bring small church specific resources to people who may not know how to find them on their own.
If I remember correctly, Karl, you had a period, I think, of time where the church really did grow, beyond the average size church to, what was it? Was it 400 or 600 or something like that?
Yeah. We grew steadily for 15 years from the 20 originals to about 200. And then in a 2-year span, we grew from 200 to 400. So it really blossomed. And then in less than a year, it was down to under 100. And there hadn't been a scandal and there hadn't been a split. And that was when I left for counseling. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So part of what I did in redefining success in ministry was I tried to figure out what had happened. And there were a handful of principles I discovered. Principle number one was I'm wired to be a small church guy and not to be a big church guy. So when I made the adjustments, when we got over the 200 barrier and I made the adjustments to go from shepherd to rancher and from pastor to manager, I was miserable because I'm more a hands-on pastor. It doesn't work for me. I took those things on, but I was miserable. And a church was being pastored by a pastor who was miserable, and people could sense that something was off. And we looked around afterwards and realized almost none of it was conversion growth. We were the cool church for a while. And we weren't seeing people come to Christ. We were entertaining bored Christians. And then when another church near us got cooler, they left and went there and took some of our folks with us. So some of it was on me that I was not in the right place that I should be, and I needed to re-understand my gifting. Some of it was that we weren't doing the kind of discipleship and the kinds of outreach to reach new people. We were just transferring people from one church to the other. And it was fun to be the cool church for a while, but I'm glad now that it didn't work, because I think if we had maintained growth in the place that I was emotionally and spiritually, and by simply attracting bored Christians to the place that was cool, we could have built a large church, but it would have been very shallow, and I would have broken myself in the process.
I don't think we talked about this, and if we did, forgive me, but I went to seminary with a guy. We used to play golf every Monday because at that time, clergy got in free. It was cool. It was a great course. And I remember Andrew turned to me one day and he just said, I just think everyone's got a number on their back. And he said, some people's number is 50, some is 150, some's 200, some's 1,000, some's 20,000 when it comes to church. I've never forgotten that. And I'm wondering what you think of that theory. Do you think most of us have a number on your back? Like you were kind of arguing, I think I'm wired to be a small church pastor. That's how God designed me. That's how God made me. Other people like Rick Warren, he was probably wired for 20,000. He's got a number on his back. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I like to refer to it as shoe size. Right? Nobody complains that my feet didn't get any bigger. This is just this is just what works for my body, right? And there's no reason for it to get bigger. And I do think that. I think if we look around and we ask, for instance, why are 80 to 90% of the churches in the world under 200? I think a lot of that, we immediately want to find a reason why that's bad. We immediately want to fix it as though it's a problem. My question is, what if that's not a problem? What if all these small churches are a part of God's strategy? Not his entire strategy. Big churches are included in the strategy too, but it seems like God's strategy for 2,000 years and counting has been to have a whole lot of small churches, which means we need a whole lot of small church pastors, which means a whole lot of us, I think, are called to small shepherding ministry. And when I talk to pastors and I ask them, try to imagine back when you were first called to ministry, what did you imagine yourself doing? And most of them will answer things like preaching on Sunday, maybe even studying to preach on Sunday, visiting people in the hospital. And they will name a list of things that are almost exclusively small church specific skills. Very few will answer with, I want to manage a large staff. I want to, build a large facility. Now, there are a handful that do, and I'm grateful for those, because if everybody pastored like me, nothing would have ever gotten built. We'd still be worshiping in caves. So we need those builders, but I think they are a far smaller percentage. And part of the challenge we've had now over the last 40 years is we've unintentionally given the typical small church pastor like me the impression that if they're not getting bigger, somehow they're failing. And I think that, yes, sometimes that is the result of failure, but I think most of the time it's simply, that's the number on your back, that's your shoe size, that's where God has called you and where you do your best kind of ministry.
I'd love to know, because there are leaders listening right now who might be wired as small church pastors, but are at 300, 400, 500. I'd love to know from your own experience, when you had that season, what didn't feel right? Like, what didn't fit for you?
Well, like I said, I moved into management mode. And so I was spending my time, overseeing staff members and trying to find a new facility and trying to raise funds. And none of those things suit me. If the church, I'm not currently pastoring my church. I'm currently a member of the church. My youth pastor became my lead pastor. We had this wonderful succession that took place similar to, and very shortly after what happened with you at Connexus. And so that's gone well. But today, in the current environment, if our church were to go through a similar growth spurt and to double or even triple in the next couple of years, we could do it well, because when we assessed what went wrong the last time, one of the key things that we were missing was discipleship. I went out and hired outside staff when our church grew because I hadn't trained our own people to lead the church. Today, if we were to double or triple in the next 2 or 3 years, we wouldn't have to hire a single staff person from outside the church. We could just take our part-time people and put them up to full-time, and take the people who are already volunteering and give them some funds to be able to do so. We are a church of about 150 or so now. That seems to be our shoe size. But if we came 300 or 400, we could adapt to that overnight, because while we have 150 to 200 on a Sunday, we have the systems in place for double that size easily.
I think you raise a really good point that church growth became an obsession, and it was a movement that's peaked and, has faded, et cetera, et cetera. And yet a lot of the assumptions around that, quote, industry back in the day were there. Where did this obsession come from?
That's the big question that inspired the book, because I feel for the last 10 to 11 years, as I've been working with small church pastors, I got to the point about 2 or 3 years ago where I thought to myself, I feel like I'm just pulling bodies out of the river. All these people who are so discouraged that their church isn't getting bigger. And in many cases, everything else about the church is good. When you talk to them, the ministry they're doing, the kind of mission that they have, they're forward looking. It's great, but the numbers just aren't happening for them. And they are where I was. We're almost ready to leave. And I thought, okay, instead of just pulling bodies out of the river, which I'm going to continue to do, let's go upriver and see who's tossing the bodies in. So what I did was I did a deep study into the church growth movement, and I thought I knew where I would find the culprits, and I did not find them where I thought I would. Predominantly, the church growth movement began in the 70s and really came into its own in the 1980s and 1990s. Out of the teachings of a man named Donald McGavran. McGavran was a missionary in India for about 30 years. And he learned, he saw how God was using people to bring entire villages to Christ all at once. And he started seeing this and going, how do entire people movements come to Jesus at once? And he studied this and he spent time working on it, thinking, maybe God is doing something here that we can learn from. He then, before he retired, spent some time in several African nations where the same things were happening, came home and wrote what is widely, in fact, unquestionably considered the first church growth book ever, called The Bridges of God. It's the first book literally where the term church growth ever appears in print. And so he started teaching that. He wrote that, and then he opened the Church Growth Institute at Fuller in Pasadena, right near where I live. And for the first 7 years, this is where it started to turn for me, and I started going, okay, this is not what I expected. For the first 7 years, he would not allow American pastors to attend the class. Now, it
was all international.
Yeah, you can't just say no American pastors allowed. They get upset at that. So what he did was he had 3 requirements. You have to have the mastery of at least one other language. You have to have done some work outside of your country of origin. And 3, you have to show a mastery of an indigenous people group outside of your own. And so that excludes 99.9% of North American pastors very easily. So he's teaching almost entirely foreign pastors. And as I studied that, I thought, okay, that's the curious thing. So I actually talked with Gary McIntosh, who wrote Donald McGavran's biography, and asked him why that was the case. And he said, and I'm summarizing his findings, and I'm using my own terminology now. he said basically Donald McGavran was concerned that if American pastors got a hold of these church growth principles, instead of using them to see people movements come to Christ, we'd use them to turn it into a big church contest. Again, my phrasing, not McIntosh's and not Wagner's. And sure enough, what happened was when he finally did invite pastors in, that's what we did. And for the last 30 to 40 years, to put it bluntly, we've kind of got this big church contest going. And so, the main speakers at most of the conferences now, the first line in their bio is they took a church from 30 to 3,000 in just 3 years. So it's not even enough that we got big. We got to get big fast. And that's kind of become the marker for whether or not a church is doing successful and good ministry. And so so the question then became, why are Americans obsessed with that? And so I had to do a deep dive into American history, and it actually comes from America's best ideas. So the First Amendment, I don't think there is a higher ideal for governing a people than the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. These are America's best ideas by a long shot. But here's the thing. If you have freedom of religion, therefore, you don't have a state-sponsored church. Unlike in Europe, where they all came from, who wrote the First Amendment, in Europe, if you've got a state-sponsored church, when the state collects taxes, they also collected tithes, and then they distributed those tithes to the state-sponsored pastors and their churches. So if you were in a state-sponsored church, you didn't have to worry about attendance or offering because you're getting your monthly government check. But in America, if there's no state-sponsored church, you can believe what you want, you can plant any church you want, but we ain't paying the bills. You got to raise your funds. So immediately, the pastors who can attract the largest crowds, can get the most money, can build the biggest buildings, and size then becomes evidence of success.
So it was sort of some unintended consequences then from the founder who was trying to keep it small and kind of knew, hey, this could get out of control. And you're right, it's a uniquely American story. And it's all those things we admire about America, initiative, entrepreneurship, the belief that you can do it, but it's got a shadow side as well. What impact did the suburbs have on the church growth movement?
Yeah, that was another surprise. I did not expect that in my book about church growth, I'd write an entire chapter about the rise of the suburbs. But the research led me there. So start with this. When you picture a mega church in your mind, what do you see?
Yep. It's in the suburbs. It's big. It's got massive acreage.
Exactly. And so, and when you, and think of the most influential mega churches of the last 20 to 30 years, where are they? They're in Lake Forest. They're in South Barrington. They're in Alpharetta. They are in wealthy suburbs of large cities. Right? Not exclusively. There's Brooklyn Tabernacle. There's Bethel in Redding, which is a small town in Northern California. So not all of them, but predominantly, the biggest churches and the most influential megachurches are in wealthy suburbs of large cities. And that's because when the suburbs came along, the suburbs came because of two things, because of the rise of the automobile, and then because the building of the interstates in the 1960s. And so now all of a sudden, Dad, who works in the city, doesn't have to live in the city because he can now drive into the city in less than half an hour on these wonderful new interstates in their brand new car, and then drive back home again for the evening. Okay. And this is where you then have this idealized picture and often parodied picture of the 1950s and the 1960s bored housewife in the suburbs to hardworking dad having an affair in the city during the day, right? The Mad Men thing, that comes out of the rise of the suburbs. So as people are moving to the suburbs, predominantly people who have the money to go to the suburbs and the people who have the money to buy a car and the amount of gas that a car takes to drive in and out, which means predominantly folks who look like you and me, whiter folks. So poorer people and minorities then are stuck in the city because they can't afford to move to the suburbs. So the suburbs become large, the suburbs become predominantly white, and businesses follow that because that's where the people and the money are. And as they should, churches and pastors look around and go, there's a lot of people moving out there. They need churches too. So the churches go to the suburb, but now the church in the suburb has a different opportunity and a different model for everything from how their campus will look to what people want from the church in the suburb than what they wanted in the city or what they wanted in the small town. And so because this is where the people are moving, you get new ideas, you build churches, and they start to grow large. And then we look at the churches in the suburbs that are getting large and we go, oh, we should do what they're doing. But if you're in a small town, if you're in an agricultural area, or if you're downtown in a large city, there's only so much you can learn from the suburban megachurch because you're in a very, very different environment. But it became idealized over the last 20 to 30 years. And then people who couldn't match that kind of growth started feeling like maybe there's a problem with me, but it isn't that there's a problem with you. It's that the city and the farmland and the small town have a very different lifestyle, and their churches need to look very different than the suburban megachurch.
Obviously, in the last few years, digital ministry has taken that to a whole other level. What are the opportunities and some of the obstacles, in your view, that social media and digital ministry present, Karl?
Yeah, I encourage every church of every size to get online in some way or another. First of all, you got to have a website. In most places, if you don't have a website, you might as well, not expect anybody new to come, because virtually everybody will check you out online first. And if they can't find you online, they won't look. But for smaller churches, this is something that I've been really considering recently. And I believe it was Chad Brooks who was on my podcast and walked me through this a little bit. And the way I look at it is this. He actually says, I encourage smaller churches to stop live streaming their services, but to start podcasting their sermons instead. And here's why. And I think it's a really logical thought through. When you live stream your service and you are in a small church and you don't have the technical expertise, you don't have people who do this for a living, who know how to set up multiple cameras and so on, the way you're presenting yourself as the first look to your community is probably going to be low quality. You're going to have a camera stationary set up in the back. It's not going to look great. They're going to watch people come and go for the first few minutes while everybody's finding their seat. They're going to watch as people turn around and shake hands. And the music mix is going to be off. Even if you've got great musicians in a small church, the music mix online is going to be completely different. And you don't have the professionals who know how to make that mix work. So your first impression is not going to be as good as it feels in the room. So instead of doing the lives, and plus, here's the deal. If you're a small church pastor and your sermon goes viral, it won't be because it was the best sermon you ever preached. It will be because it was the stupidest thing you ever said. Right?
There's a lot of truth in that.
That's what they're going to catch, and that's what's going to go viral. They're going to take that clip. So if you don't live stream it, just get a really good microphone so that your sermon can be heard well. Because let's be honest with ourselves. When people watch a service, when I watch my home church service, when I'm on the road, I scroll through the worship and I just get to the sermon. And half the time I'm listening to the sermon, I'm not watching it on YouTube. I'm listening to it while I'm out for a walk or while I'm doing chores or something else. 99% of us probably only listening anyway. So who cares? So you're not going to do video well anyway. So don't try. Get the audio well, because any church of any size can get a good enough microphone that the audio quality will be solid. And then get a young person in your church, get almost anybody who knows basic stuff. You can go to Spotify right now and put a podcast up way easier than you ever could before. And on Monday or Tuesday, your sermon-only podcast comes out, and you have a chance. That one dumb thing you said that you'd really not have the world hear, you can pull that out. Or that one spot where you made a direct reference to somebody in the church and you're realizing, I probably shouldn't have mentioned so-and-so to people who don't even know who they are and what their situation is. You can edit it a little bit. You can put out just the sermon, which is all people want to hear, and then you've got a best foot forward. So we need to be using the online stuff, but the way small churches use it are going to look very different than the way big churches use it.
Do you have in your mind, or your guest, I've heard Brady Shearer give similar advice, and I think post-COVID, that's really solid counsel. Otherwise, it ends up looking like a school play. You know what I mean? Yeah. You just don't have the audio, you don't have the video, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a size at which that becomes realistic, like 500, 700, 800, 1,000? Or do you have a benchmark like that in your mind, or you think it depends on the situation?
No, it depends on who you've got. I'm in Orange County, California. We have 150 to 200 people on a Sunday, and we live stream our services with audio and video, and it looks and sounds great. Why? Because I live in Orange County, California. I got videographers and editors all over the place. I don't have anybody who owns a table saw, but but I got videographers and photographers around. So we have the skill set at a smaller size. But if you're living somewhere, in an agricultural community, you probably do have more technical people than you realize, but you're not going to have as many as we have in Orange County. So it really depends on the skill level of the people in your church more than it does the size of your congregation.
And you made a really good point I just want to underscore before we move on. Look for youth. I mean, they grew up on TikTok and YouTube and all that. And your 18-year-old is probably going to be better than most of your 48-year-olds when it comes to volunteering in the tech area, period. So we talked about some of the consequences of the obsession with size, but you meet with church leaders literally around the world who feel defeated. What are some of the intended or unintended consequences of our obsession with size?
Yeah. I have this picture in my head. Imagine if we could remove the burden of, I have to be bigger year after year from the shoulders of every single pastor in the world, small sizes and big sizes. Because I know churches that are big who, if their numbers aren't up month to month every year, they start getting depressed about their own lack of growth, even if they're already in the thousands. So if you could just simply remove the burden of, I have to get bigger by this time next year than I am at this current time next year, if that could be removed from their shoulders, I have not just a guess, but I'm convinced that this would raise the emotional health and spiritual health of pastors all around the world if that burden would be removed. Now, the challenge is you don't want to remove that burden and then also completely demotivate them where it just doesn't matter if we reach people, because this is not about settling for less. This is about having an unhealthy expectation for numbers rather than simply contributing to the growth of the kingdom of God.
And I think that's a really good tension point to dwell on for a minute, Karl, when you and I have had some really fruitful discussions over the years, on and offline. You're right. There is this obsession with numbers, this obsession with, if I don't grow, I'm a failure, which is unhealthy on about 100 levels: spiritual, emotional, psychological, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, we do have this outward focused mission, right? That I don't know too many leaders, I don't know any pastors who got into ministry to reach fewer people, right? Like, I'm hoping our church of 150 is a church of 75 next year. Nobody believes that. Nobody says that. And I think, we have a gospel that points outwards. So how do you balance, how do you manage the tension between like a God-given desire to reach people and that not very healthy pressure to grow? What do you do about that?
Yeah, that is hugely important. And it is the main question. And if I ever get pushback in this ministry to small churches, the only pushback I ever get is along those lines, like, okay, it's okay if you guys want to be small, but we want to keep reaching people, so we're going to keep getting bigger. My first response is, do you think we don't want to reach people and that's why we're small? First of all, that's not the case. And I know that's not the case you're making. But when we look at it, what we have to realize is this: my calling is not to get more people to sit in front of me on a Sunday morning. You can't go, nobody could take the Bible and do an honest reading through it, get to the end and go, oh, it's about getting more people in the building. That's what Jesus was all about. We sometimes read that into the text, but it doesn't come from the text. Okay.
Yeah, fair.
What comes from the text is missional. In fact, there's an entire chapter in Desizing the Church that I talk about what the church growth movement got right. Because I'm not just wholesale dissing the church growth movement. I think the church growth movement did a lot of good things, including reminding us again of the missional role that the church has, that we are supposed to be reaching people. The challenge we have is, are we okay if a congregation has a missional approach to ministry, and people are coming to Christ through the ministry of that church, but it doesn't put butts in the seat on Sunday morning. Am I okay with that kind of growth? Because that's what Donald McGavran was about when I discovered it, right? He was about, how do we increase the number of Christians in this community? And if the way to increase the number of Christians in this community is to build a whole bunch of small churches, let's do that. If the way to increase the percentage of Christians in this community is to build one big church, let's do that. If it's a combination of the two, which it usually is, then let's do that. So the question isn't, are there more people sitting in front of me year to year? The question is, can we look around and see that we are contributing to the growth of the kingdom of God, maybe in many ways outside our walls? And now with online ministry, that is going to be a higher likelihood than ever before. And we need to be not just okay with that, but celebrate it when it happens.
What else did the church growth movement get right? I appreciated that you went there.
Yeah, the church growth movement was really helpful in a whole lot of ways. One of the things that impresses me about my big church friends is their heart of generosity. How many conferences have you and I both been to that are at a large church? Why at a large church? Because that's how many people are coming to the conference. My church wouldn't hold it, okay? Mm-hmm. And that large church offers their facility usually for free. Yeah. And their entire staff is on board for that. And they've worked on it for weeks or months in advance. And they're doing it. Why? To simply share what they've learned and what the speakers are learning with as many pastors and as many churches as possible. When a church growth pastor comes up with an idea that works, they don't rush to the trademark office. Nobody's trademarking their church growth ideas. They are sharing them as quickly and as inexpensively and usually free through podcasts like yours, as quickly as possible to as many people as possible. The heart of generosity that has been created from the church growth movement is wonderful. And the lowering of denominational walls is, I think, a direct result of the church growth movement, where I am now invited. 10% of my invitations to speak are within my denomination. 90% are outside my denomination, and some denominations that hold some significantly different views than I do in my denomination on secondary issues, not salvation issues, but on secondary issues. And we're looking at them and going, those are secondary. You can help us. We can work together. And I believe that's a direct result of the church growth movement, for which I'm profoundly grateful.
I think that's really well said. And I think that's true. You know, it got over some of the tribalism, some of the parochialism of a lot of churches back in the day. The other thing that's I got a lot of directions. I'd love to take this with you, Karl. But, you know, I remember talking to Gordon MacDonald once, and Gordon's just the most beautiful human. And he was saying when he was pastoring Grace Chapel in Boston, like in Massachusetts, this was in the 70s, 50 years ago. There just weren't that many big churches. So they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to respond to it. You know, even if you look at Spurgeon's church, it wasn't that big compared to, you know, we could list 30 mega churches you've never heard of that were bigger than Charles Spurgeon's church. And a lot of that is what you said, the suburbs, mobility, our connectedness, culture changed. So the church changed with it. We are, and you know, when the church growth movement hit in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and the attractional model was born, we were inventing something we didn't understand its consequences. So I think this is a maturing of the conversation to the point where we don't have to have enemies. The small church is not the enemy, and the big church is not the enemy. Any more thoughts on that as we, you know, shift the dialogue into the mid-2020s, literally 50 years after churches for real started to become big at scale?
Yeah, when I was a kid, we would travel. I was raised in Toronto, and we would travel. We had family in Phoenix, so we would make that trek regularly. And along the way, we'd often stop at different churches on Sunday and go and speak and hear them. And I remember we went to Akron. Rex Humbard, had maybe one of the 2 or 3 biggest churches in the country. Right, that's a name that is completely dropped off the radar.
There's a name I forgot about. I haven't heard about in years. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Rex Humbard, Oral Roberts, these were the big names for a very short period of time. And he had the Cathedral of Tomorrow, right? That was the name of the church in Akron. But aside from him and Criswell in Dallas and a couple other places, You could go, when I was young, in the 1970s to early 80s, you could go to a very large, well-churched North American city and not find a single church of over 1,000 people.
True.
Right.
Yep.
Now you go to a large, well-churched city and you're going to find multiple churches over 5,000 and even over 10,000. So back in the day, when I was younger, I could go to a church, an average sized church of 75, and the biggest church in town of 750. And if they were in the same denomination, they were singing the same songs out of the same hymn book. They had the same missionaries on the wall. They ran the same children's departments and women's departments and men department. There was almost no difference except for the number of people in the room. There was a real similarity there. And so they would even like do a pulpit swap between an average size church of 75 and the biggest church in town. But as churches started getting bigger, again, the rise of the suburbs, the rise of the megachurch, and you start cracking the 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 barrier, at that point, you have to learn a whole bunch of new skills to be able to manage an organization of that size. And as they learned those skills, they would then share them, as I said earlier, their heart of generosity. They would share them through their books, through their podcasts, through their articles with every other pastor. A pastor of a church of 400 or 500 would hear that and go, oh, I can do most of that. But a pastor of a church of 40 or 50 would hear that and go, I'm going to try it, but none of it worked because the gap was now too wide. And so the mid-sized churches were getting benefit and were growing, but the typical small church was getting no benefit out of it whatsoever and is starting to feel like I did, well, I must be stupid. Because my friend of a church of 400 or 500, he went to that conference, took 7 things from it, implemented them in his church, and it worked like gangbusters. I took those same things and brought it to my church of 75, and none of it worked. I must be stupid. So here's my word to small church pastors in those situations. What they're teaching, they're not wrong, but you're not stupid. What they're saying fits their context, but because of the big numerical gap between the biggest church in town and the average church in town, that numerical gap has now created an environment that is very seldom taken into account, which is where my ministry comes from. Now we need small church specific tools that only work in small churches because the gap between the small and the big has grown. And it's an unintended byproduct of good things that have happened. But we now need to recognize what these unintended byproducts are so we can deal with them correctly.
So you and I were in Germany together earlier this year, and we spoke to a pretty large crowd. I mean, there were 7,000 people, legit. I mean, from what I could tell. And I kind of pictured a bowl, but if you just think of a conference room that went on, I think forever, Karl, and when you see 7,000 people sitting there all on a flat floor looking up at these big screens, it was something. I would love to know what that does for somebody, because I know we talked about that a little bit in the green room or at breakfast one day, you know, when you're used to speaking to 150, 200 people, and you've done conferences before, but you get in front of 7,000 people. What did that do to your head? What does that do to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, first of all, it's very exhilarating. The adrenaline is through the roof. You know, maybe not quite as much for you because you're in front of bigger crowds, but even for both of us, that was a big room, right?
I'd be lying if I said, "Oh yeah, it was just like another day." Yeah, sure. There is something intoxicating about that.
Yeah. So the adrenaline is great, which means it's a lot of fun to do. Secondly, it's great to be able to speak in one time to more people than I will speak to for the entire rest of the year combined. And I'm going to 35 other conferences this year. But that one room probably had more people in it than the other 35 combined. So you get a lot done real quick. The second thing on the negative that occurred to me was this. This is a drug that I could get addicted to really quickly if I wasn't careful. That adrenaline, I see how people can get hooked on that adrenaline and why we need to be very careful about it. The second thing that occurred to me was I was standing on a stage and the front row was farther back from me than the back row is in my home church.
I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, the stage itself was about as high as the ceiling is in my church.
Wow.
So it was almost like going on the roof of my church and pushing everybody past the back row to be able to talk to them. And as I'm speaking to them, I am looking at people, and there's less than 10% of the room is looking at me. 90% of the room is looking at my image on a screen next to me.
Correct.
And there's been studies done in the last few years since pandemic about the kind of conversation we're having right now, where it's asynchronous. We're not in the same room. We're not actually looking at each other in the face. We're trying to overcome some of that asynchronicity as much as we can. But it actually causes a change in how we perceive each other and how we communicate and how we receive that information. And so that asynchronous communication was a little uncomfortable for me. And I hunger for being in a room where when I'm looking at people, they're actually looking at me. So it had some buzz, it had some opportunity, but I also immediately saw where some of the potential dangers would be. And I'm going to tell you right up front, Carey, I am not immune to those dangers. So pastors who do speak to that size of a group on a consistent basis and who stay strong spiritually and morally and relationally and who maintain their integrity, I have the highest respect for, because that kind of adrenaline, that kind of drug can take you down fast.
Yes, and I am not immune from that drug either. It helps when things grow, but I'm constantly sifting my motivation and hopefully sifting it more every year. You know what I mean? Yeah. But 7,000 people in one room at one time, that's a thrill. Okay. Thank you for the honesty. I appreciate it. I felt it too. And yet I felt an incredible warmth too. It was a great event. It was a really good event. And they loved your talk. I think we connected okay in my talk. It was a lot of fun to do that event. So thank you, GLS Germany, for that. We really appreciate
absolutely.
that. So I want to get into some signs maybe that your church is struggling with an unhealthy obsession over numbers or growth or whatever. And this is true not just of small churches. You could have a church of 5,000 that's got an unhealthy obsession with growth, or a church of 50 where the pastor just can't rest because you want to be 60 by Christmas, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What are some signs?
The first sign is comparison. If you are constantly comparing your ministry to other ministries, either you will be bigger than them and filled with pride, or smaller than them and filled with shame. And neither pride or shame is the basis for healthy ministry, not for you and not for your church. Wow. So comparison will kill. That's the thing we've got to be very, very careful about. I remember a few years ago, I talked to somebody who had a smaller church, and they were running about 150 or so. And a friend of theirs who was pastoring a mega church, he was complaining, I can't seem to get it above 150. And he told me, he reminded me, you realize at 150, you're bigger than like 85% of the churches in the country. And I felt a lot better. And I thought, that's not a great way to make us feel better, that I'm better than, right? That it was the comparison thing, and that's I'm not great, but I'm better than them. Jesus told a parable about that kind of comparison that wasn't really all that good, and yet we do it far too often. So the comparison, if we're constantly comparing with others, that's a real danger sign. Secondly, if someone asks you, how's your church going, and you don't know how to answer it non-numerically, you've got a problem. Right. So here's what I actually tell my fellow small church pastors, because they'll go to conferences and they dread going because somebody's going to ask them, how's your church going? It's like, what do I tell them? We're still the same size as last year. So here's what I tell them. Before you go, preload your mind with 2 or 3 life transformation stories, because you won't remember them off the top of your head on the spot when they ask you. Be ready. Think through, okay, what's happened in our church in the last few months about that person who came to Christ, about that person who left the church and came back again, about a marriage that was on the rocks, but your divorce recovery class is really working and they've come back to each other again. Come up with 2 or 3 stories. Don't betray any confidences, obviously, in those stories. But when people ask you, how's your church running? You can say, let me tell you about so-and-so. And there's a power in story that I have the last 5 to 10 years, I've really come to appreciate, and I'm doing more study on the power of story on the human mind. There's a reason the Bible says that Jesus never taught without telling a parable, without telling a story. And I think we have swung the pendulum too far in the last 20 to 30 years, where we've become obsessed with statistics, and we need to swing it back a little bit more towards story, because not every church will have statistics they can be proud of, but every healthy church can have a great story to tell.
You also make an argument that I thought was really interesting. You argue that Christian celebrity culture basically guarantees moral failure. That's a big statement. And if I got that wrong and you want to nuance it, please do. But let's unpack that.
You quoted the title of the chapter.
Guarantees failure.
Yeah, it does. The full title of the chapter is Inevitable: How the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. And yes, I sat and stared at that title a long time before I decided to actually put it in the book, because that's a big swing. But I stand by it. I don't believe that becoming a celebrity guarantees moral failure. As I said earlier, there are pastors who have big churches and big platforms who have maintained their integrity, and I have massive admiration for that, because I believe that's very difficult to do. So it does not guarantee moral failure. But the Christian celebrity culture does.
In other words, this is going to keep spitting out moral failure.
Yes. When you are constantly idealizing big microphones on tall stages under bright lights, you will attract people who want a big microphone on a tall stage under bright lights. You will attract narcissists, because that's what narcissists are drawn to. They want that. So if you create a celebrity culture, you will attract people who want to be a celebrity. And if celebrity as a byproduct of good ministry is one thing, but celebrity as a goal is really dangerous.
I think that's very well phrased. And, to go back to the drug metaphor, I don't have really experience with drugs, but there have been times where things have gone really, really well. We're in a growth season. That could have been at the church. That could have been, here in what I've done for the last 10 years, where you just look at the numbers and you just can't believe them. And I feel a rush sometimes. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's what drugs feel like, because it is like a drug, and I can see how you get addicted. And I just want to echo what you said. I got a lot of friends who lead large organizations, large ministries, who have not bowed the knee, who have maintained their integrity. And I think that's really, really admirable, because it is a big challenge. So what's a better way forward, Karl? Like, when you think about how to think about yourselves, because I think you're right. Ministry's discouraging enough. Leadership's discouraging in and of itself. You have good seasons and bad seasons. So what are some pointers toward health as you look toward the future?
Yeah. I've been in ministry about 50 years, and I've seen 3 kind of big trends come through. And depending on your and your listeners' background, denomination, and experience, you'll experience these in different ways. But here's how I experienced it. In the 60s and 70s, there was the revival wave that came through. We were going to fix our church by having a revival again, a renewal of God's Spirit. And so we're going to pray. You have people like Larry Lee and so on who came through, and it was all about prayer, and it was all about worship. And there's going to be a revival, and that's what's going to bring people back. And then in the 1980s and 90s and into the O's, it became institutionalized, and then we got to the management phase. And that was when everybody was reading the management type books. And, I can go through the list of all those folks, and I learned a lot from them as well, just like I did from some of the folks in the revivalist phase. And now we're not in the management phase anymore. Now we're in the activist phase. And in the last 10 or so years, everybody's an activist about something, and everybody's wanting the pastor to fly their flag, sometimes literally, right? MAGA on the right, Black Lives Matter on the left, right? You pick your flag and fly it. And it's about activism. And now activism is going to get us to where if we just elect the right person, or if we just get behind the right cause, that's going to fix what's wrong with us. So at this point right now, the idea that you're going to fix your church by better management feels kind of old and tired, and because the height of that has waned. And the old school folks want to go back to the revivalist phase and say, we got to have a renewed revival. Now, do I want better management? Yes. Do I want a revival of God's Spirit? Yes. Do I want to have to activate people towards good causes? Yes. All of those three things can be used in the right way. But if you have any of those and you are really pushing them, but you aren't a person of integrity, none of the rest of those things are going to matter. So instead of saying we've got to have just a revival again, or we've got to have better management again, or we've got to get more votes on our side again to fix the church, here's the way I want us to look at it. The two chapters where my book turns are entitled Discipleship Fixes Everything, and Integrity is the New Competence. I think we need to have a two-pronged approach. We need to double down on discipleship, and we need to triple down on integrity. Because if you look around right now and you ask any person who has left the church, and they might use a phrase like ex-evangelical or deconstructing, whatever term they're going to use, doesn't matter. If they have left the church, you will not find a single person who says, yeah, I was going to this small church and they just couldn't get the quality of their videos right. It was just so cheesy. I didn't know what to believe, so I left the church and I don't believe in Jesus anymore. Nobody has left the church because of our lack of technical excellence. But you'll find a whole lot who have left because we were not people of our word. We're losing them because of our lack of integrity. And on the other side, we're losing people because we didn't disciple them into maturity and their faith remained shallow. And so it didn't take root. And so stopping going during pandemic, I just never bothered showing back up again because, I wasn't getting anything out of it anyway. So we have got to get back to discipleship again, and we have to be people of integrity again, because quite frankly, we've got a whole bunch of loss of trust that we need to earn back again. And the only way to earn trust back again is not to get our technical excellence in place, it's to be people of integrity again.
So what do you do with numbers? Let's say, talk to the pastor, the leader whose numbers aren't moving. You've been 50 people for the last 5 years. Few people have moved away. Few people have taken the place. Maybe there's not a lot of baptisms, but you're not seeing, quote, progress, if you want to call it that, or feel free to substitute your own phase. What do you do with that? Do you just ignore those and continue on? Do you pay attention to numbers? What do you do with numbers?
Yeah, numbers are helpful to inform us, but they should never define us. So that's one of the great blessings that the church growth movement brought is let's take a look at numbers that do matter. One of the unintended negative consequences of that is now we're looking at a whole bunch of numbers that don't necessarily matter as well. So let's use numbers that inform us and not define us. One of the things that you've written about a lot in the last couple of years is let's not measure engagement as much as let's not measure attendance as much as we measure engagement, right? Now, that's true from a big church standpoint. Not just attendance, but engagement. In a small church, however, engagement isn't the issue. And a lot of small churches, quite frankly, people are way too engaged. They're all up in each other's business all the time.
Yeah, that's
right?
fair.
So in a small church, it's not so much about is everybody engaged in the life of the church, but are we having an impact? Are we influencing our community? Are we making a difference? So we need to ask questions. And the smaller the church is, the more this is true. Here's the deal. The bigger churches, there's something called the law of large numbers. And the law of large numbers states that the larger the group is, the more predictably it behaves. So if you've got a church or an organization of any type in the thousands of people or into the tens of thousands, metrics really are very helpful to inform you, because a 10 to 15% change up or down annually can mean hundreds or thousands of people. But an typical size church of 50, and that's about where the average size church in North America is right now, 50. In a typical church of 50, your numbers can vary by 100% from week to week, let alone 15%. So the metrics don't really inform us as much. So what we need to do is we need to look around at the non-numerical markers of church health. As an example, are people signing up to help out in ministry teams, or are they fighting each other for titles on committees? Those are two very different approaches to health. When you talk to people, are they excited about inviting people to the church? Or are they like, yeah, on Easter, we go to the big church down the street because they've got a higher quality program. I'm kind of embarrassed to bring my family to our church. Well, then you got a problem. When they show up, do they fill up the back rows first or the front rows first? Is your church getting younger or is your church getting older? When the service is over, do people run as fast as they can for their cars, or do they hang around until you got to push them out the doors? When somebody's sick, how easy is it to get people to sign up for the meal train to bring people to bring food for that sick person until they're feeling well again? Is it like pulling teeth just to get somebody to show up with a meal, or do they sign up like crazy and want to help out as much as they can? These are all non-numerical ways to take a look and go, okay, this church is actually really healthy. We're doing some wonderful things. We're serving each other. We're worshiping, and we're serving our community. And they don't have numerical markers to them. But the challenge is you've got to pay attention to them. I encourage every small church pastor to keep what I call a healthy church logbook. And it can be as simple as an empty book of pages, or it can be done online, whatever works for you. And every time something great happens at your church, write it down. And then 6 months to a year down the road, when you're wondering, have we accomplished anything in this church this year? Go through the logbook and remind yourself of that marriage that was restored, of that alcoholic who's now sober and is serving Jesus, of that couple that got saved but moved away, so you don't get to count them in your end of year numbers. We need to keep track of the non-numerical things more purposefully, because the numbers are easy to see and the non-numerical qualifiers take some time to look for, but they're worth looking for.
Karl, such a helpful conversation. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to touch on before we wrap up today?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Well, I did mention earlier, the Discipleship Fixes Everything as a title of one of my chapters. So let me take a moment with that. When the way I write my book is, I just, as I have an idea, I just throw it all onto a page, and I end up with this really long Word document of a couple hundred pages. And then for this book, I knew where parts 1 and 2 and 3 were going to go. Why is small a problem? What's the history of it, and so on? Or not? Why is our obsession with bigness a problem? But at the end, where I wanted to bring some answers, here's a better way forward. I just threw a whole bunch of ideas onto a big document. And when I got to it, I thought, okay, I need to now organize this in a way that people can actually read and follows themes and that makes sense. So I started going through each of the pieces, and this is what happened. I looked at the first one and went, well, that's really about discipleship. Second one, well, that's really about discipleship. Third one, well, that's really about discipleship. And as I'm going through them, I realized, man, it's like discipleship fixes everything. And then I went, oh, do I believe that? Is that actually true? And think about this. Can you imagine a problem that a church might have that discipleship won't fix? Because I can't. Lack of finances, lack of volunteerism, immorality, disunity, lack of evangelism. Discipleship fixes all of those things. If we are really discipling our people, discipleship will fix all of those things. And I've got this conversation in my head that did not happen in the Bible. It only happens in my head. But here's the conversation that happened in my head. In my head, I have this conversation where near the end of Jesus' time on earth, before he ascends into heaven, he gathers his disciples and he goes, okay, guys, here's the plan. I'm going to build my church. You're going to go make disciples. And they respond with, got it. We're going to go build your church. And he goes, no. I'm going to build my church. You're going to go make disciples. And they go, oh, we've got it. We'll go build your church. I'm like, no. And it feels like we've been having this argument with Jesus for 2,000 years, where Jesus continually keeps coming in and going, guys, wait a second. I'm not calling you to build my church. I will build my church. I know what I'm doing. I will do that. Make disciples. But I think one of the big unintended negative consequences of the church growth movement is that a whole lot of us are trying to take that burden off of Jesus' shoulders and say, we're going to go build the church now. And Jesus is saying, stop it. I'm way better at this than you are. I'll build my church. If you make disciples, I will fulfill my side of that bargain. I will, and he has been for 2,000 years, building his church relentlessly. So we've got to stop trying to do Jesus' job and make sure that we do what he called us to do, which is go and make disciples.
It's amazing that we've survived, isn't it? When you look at church history, it really is. There must be Jesus who's building this, because we would have sunk it a long time ago. Karl, The book is called Desizing the Church. It's out this year. Where are you most active online these days?
And my website is karlvaters.com. So your name and my name are both interesting to spell. If they can spell our names, they can find us online.
If they get close, they're going to find you,
exactly.
right?
I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, X now, and Facebook as well. But karlvaters.com is the clearinghouse for everything with that I write, for my books, for my podcast, and everything else.
Right. Karl, I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you for your ministry. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carey.